Never Look at the Woman in the White Dress by Lawriejaffa. It's been almost a week since I first arrived at the Isle of Jarrah, just one of over 200 small isles that linger off the west coast of Scotland. Jarrah is a lonely rock and the most cut off of all of the Scottish islands. A windswept place dominated by volcanic rocks and bleak hills. On Jarrah's northmost tip is a tiny village, which the locals call Sittin. And it's from that desolate place that I cannot escape. I am not, however, imprisoned by the people that live here. In fact, they have sent for a doctor from the mainland to remove me. They're concerned by my refusal to leave my car, and after days of supplying me with food and water through a small gap in the window, they have finally succumbed to their impatience. I don't expect them to understand the circumstances that find me imprisoned here. I am confined against my will by someone or something so terrible and otherworldly that I might welcome death over the prospect of it finding me. I am so fearful of the consequences of what will happen when they pull me from my car that I've taken the precaution of writing this testimony, which, if you're reading this now, was indeed my last. My name is Alexander. I'm a recently widowed high school teacher from Edinburgh, Scotland. My wife, whom I love dearly, recently passed away after succumbing to a long illness. In the aftermath of that tragedy, I sought to reestablish old friendships with my former schoolmates. They were quite amused at the fact that I had become a teacher, and were mostly married, preoccupied with children and family life. In many ways, this accentuated my feelings of loneliness. And so it was with some perverse relief that I found one old friend, Simon, who had experienced a life-changing tragedy of his own. His wife had left him, and, overwrought with grief, he'd thrown himself into his work, expending that terrible energy with frequent travels across the Scottish Isles. It was his job to monitor fish stocks and the general health of sea creatures, so that he could file environmental reports to the government. He visited me in Edinburgh, where we had a wonderful time regaling the tales of our youth before he left for his tour of the islands. A week after he departed, I received a message that carried with it a strange sense of unease. Alexander, I invite you to join me on the Isle of Jarrah, where I've secured us lodgings. It's a beautiful place, and I would especially be grateful if you could come, because I need some help leaving the island, his letter said. The tone of the message was strange, and I wondered why he would suggest that he needed help to leave. I learned that the island was visited twice a week by a small ship that brought supplies from the mainland. And while there was no indication of a threat in his message, surely he could telephone the authorities should the worst-case scenario arise. Yet, amidst the drudgery of teaching and grief, this message was a welcome diversion. Even better that it was also an invitation to adventure. So I packed my belongings, and within 24 hours I was standing on the bow of the Seahorse as it penetrated the icy winds of the Atlantic to arrive at the harbor of Sittin. Simon was there to greet me, dressed more appropriately for the blustering sea winds than I, with a thick coat, hood, and scarf. I arrived in the same threadbare suit that I usually wore to work. On first glance, he looked quite all right. His broad features resplendent with a welcoming grin, and yet, I couldn't help but miss the dark circles under his eyes, which betrayed sleepless nights. As any good friend should, I marched Simon, with the aid of his directions, towards the village tavern. There I checked in my belongings and ordered us a full bottle of malt whiskey, which, accompanied by the roaring fire of the barroom, did much to restore my friend's spirits. Soon we laughed and joked as we had during his visit to Edinburgh, and I decided not to mention the strange aspect of his letter. I would leave that for tomorrow. That first night I slept well, And, to my delight, as the sun rose the next day, I observed that the weather had dramatically transformed from the wintry chill of the evening before to a bright summer's day. The ship would not return for 2 days, which gave Simon and me plenty of time to discuss his situation. Meanwhile, the historian in me was rather keen to explore the island for its famous ruin, an early Christian chapel which stood atop a sharp cliff overlooking the sea. Fortunately, I had packed a pair of hiking boots, and so, after a hearty breakfast, we ventured for a hike through the rugged hills of the island. It was a grueling walk, but the beautiful weather aided us greatly, and after a few hours we caught sight of the distant ruins. Up until then, Simon had been in good form, amiable and cheerful even. So I hadn't as yet broached the subject of his strange message. This would soon change, for reasons that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I cannot begin to describe the inexplicable dread that fills me as I write what happened next. And I'm sure I will lose you along with the feelings of doubt, skepticism, and even ridicule. Just know that as you read these words, I may already be dead on account of what happened next. Do not laugh at it. Do not laugh at me, and do not come to this place. As we traversed the gravel path that ran along the base of the hill, I looked up towards the ruins which almost glittered under the afternoon sun. They were beautiful, but the hill was about 300 feet high, and I was already exhausted. Simon, whose face betrayed a peculiar anxiety, seemed suddenly relieved by my hesitation, and he suggested that we keep along the path instead, which would eventually return us to the village, while offering us some spectacular views of the ruin from afar. I consented to this, upon which Simon laughed with relief, and so we carried on. As we continued walking, I glanced up from time to time to admire the ruin, and it was during one such glimpse that I caught sight of a pretty woman at the top of the hill waving at us. At the distance she stood, she was no larger than my thumb, and I could discern from that view that she was a beautiful young woman with a cheerful expression, with long locks of curly blonde hair and a white cotton dress that came to her feet. She waved her arm in a wide sweeping motion while calling out for our attention. The wind was picking up, and it obscured her words, but her familiar expression clearly implied that she must already be acquainted with Simon. If I were a young man, I might even have been jealous, for she was a radiant creature. I tapped his shoulder and said, "Simon, you have an admirer up there." As I reached to point up to her, I was surprised to find Simon still walking, refusing to stop. His body was tensed and his breathing was quick. "Don't look at her. Keep walking," he said. I was perturbed by this, as it seemed incredibly rude to ignore her. She persisted in waving, still cheerfully cooing for his attention. I was a little angry then, as the gentleman in me wondered if she was perhaps some naive girl that he'd previously exploited. Stopping in my tracks, I called out to Simon. With careful intention, he turned to avoid looking at the ruin and grabbed my shoulder, practically dragging me back with him along the trail. I almost stumbled, and as I did, I turned one last time to see the girl on the hill. I shrugged apologetically on behalf of my callous friend. I think that she registered this in some way, as her attention was now fixed upon myself as she continued to wave. The hour's walk back to the village continued in a dour silence, as Simon refused to answer my questions concerning the woman that we'd left behind. Surely a spoilt love affair was not the cause of his strange message. A sense of calm returned to Simon once we made it back to the fiery hearth of the tavern bar, and eventually, a few evening whiskeys loosened his tongue. Fidgeting with his glass, Simon looked at me with a flash sense of urgency shimmering in his eyes. "Alex, was she looking at me?" he asked me. I nodded, and then I recalled how her attention had eventually fixed itself on me. I didn't tell him, unsure as I was of what any of this meant. As the evening wore on, His strange mood worsened as he became drunk. It was quite distressing to see Simon like this, reminiscent as it was of my own dark days following the loss of my wife. I decided then to confront him about his strange message, but first I needed a moment alone to collect myself for this intervention. I say this, but I also believe that his own state of anxiety was provoking something of its kind in me also. I just needed a moment to myself. Simon gave me the keys to his rental car, which was parked just outside the tavern. It was dark outside, and that beautiful day had descended into the rage of a summer storm, the type that produced vicious bolts of lightning and rain pellets so hard that they might crack the window panes. I would brave it all for a moment to catch my breath in solitude. So I dashed out of the tavern and slipped into Simon's car. So terrific was the storm that even in the seconds that it had taken me to run to the car, I was already soaked to the bone. The weather took a different form from the comfort and privacy of the car. The sharpness of the rain felt subdued in the car's interior. I could feel something like a sense of calm return to me as I planned out how I might tackle the serious discussion ahead. The windscreen was swamped with rain. It obscured my view of the street ahead. And in a village such as this, there are no street lamps, so the only light was emanating from the windows of people's homes, which served to silhouette rather than reveal that which stood in its path. And something did stand in its path. I pressed my face against the windscreen as an uncanny dread engulfed me. There, in the middle of the night, in the middle of the road, in the middle of a storm, was a person standing some 20 feet ahead. I could see virtually nothing except a sliver of their shape, a rim of light that came and went with a movement, a familiar movement, a wide, sweeping motion of an arm waving above the head. Then it shuffled forward, closer and closer towards the light to reveal itself. The beautiful girl from before, now soaked with rain, yet seemingly oblivious to the storm, waved at me. Her expression, completely unchanged from before, still exuded the amiable familiarity one might encounter upon bumping into a casual acquaintance in the street. As she moved closer and closer, I could see her lips moving as she appeared to speak in casual conversation. It looked as if she were asking simple things like, "How are you?" and "It's been a long time," though again, I stressed that I could not hear a word. She kept coming until she reached the driver's seat where I was sitting. It was locked already as she pressed her face close to the glass. Her expression remained constant, friendly with a hint of confusion, as she gestured for me to open the car door. She seemed to exist out of all time and place, but there she remained, in the pouring rain, tapping her fingers at the window, smiling and speaking soundlessly. How can I describe the way that she stared at me? Why, despite her amiable appearance, was I so terrified? It felt like she was from another place, a void of sorts, and that in that place she could only see one thing in the darkness, and that thing was prey. That thing was me. Smiling as she traced her fingers across the window, she gracefully reached for the back door. Was it locked? In petrified silence, I choked in horror as I heard the clunk of the door opening. With a speed that one can only manage when driven by absolute terror, I rushed to pull back the door. In the struggle, the terrific sound of the storm tore into the car. My senses were overwhelmed by the sight of the woman in white as the lightning flashed across her face, revealing for a moment what lay behind the beautiful mask of fake humanity. With every door locked, she continued to tap at the windows, to coo at me with alluring looks and soundless phrases, to beg me to please open the door. But in that flash of lightning, I had seen the truth. And so fearful was I that I might see it again, that I hid my head under my coat and pressed my fingers into my ears. When the morning came, the tavern keeper told me that Simon was gone. Finally, the meaning of his message had become clear as I learned that he'd boarded the Seahorse that day and had returned to the mainland. As the day wore on, concerned locals tried to lure me out of the car, but she's still out there, somewhere, waiting for that moment when I will be forced out of the car. As I write these final words, I can already see the doctor headed my way with a group of men. They think they're going to save me, but the woman behind them has other plans.